Hey, I love therapy, and in fact, I've been going to therapy since I was around 6 years old. Though I talk about therapy a lot and may interview some therapists on the show on occasion, nothing that is said in this podcast should be considered a replacement for therapy. If you are struggling, I urge you to please seek guidance from a therapist because you are absolutely worth it. Hello, everyone. You are listening to Wine, Dine, and 69, a podcast about dating, relationships, sex, and self-love. I am your host, Rachel Dalton. I hope everybody's doing well. I am recording this in the middle of a study break. I have an exam that I'm taking tomorrow for my career, which has just been interesting. I've always had this story that I'm not good at math, and then for some reason I decided when I was 31 to switch to a career that does math. Interesting choices. And I'm pretty good at it on the day-to-day stuff, but those tests, the continuing education tests that they have people take frequently have less to do with what you're actually doing on a day-to-day basis. So that's kind of where I'm at. But working on this has gotten me started, or really continued the process that I've had about learning how to learn. Learning can be really uncomfortable, and I realized that when I was younger, I was able to get pretty good grades by not trying very hard, and I didn't really want to extend the effort to have that motivation to try hard. It's uncomfortable for me to try something right away and to not be good at it. So historically, I have just not done those things that I'm not good at, which is no way to live, obviously. So I feel like this is like a thread that I discontinued when I had my last math class in high school, and I'm kind of picking back up now. An important lesson, ADHD, imposter syndrome, it all comes from these perfectionist tendencies. I mean, if you think about it, I have an exam. So the logical thing, A to B, is you have an exam. Okay, you're going to study for the exam. Not so, not in Rachel brain. In Rachel brain, it is you have an exam. Okay, we're going to pretend that you don't have an exam. We're going to pretend that it doesn't exist, and we're going to procrastinate and do literally every project around your apartment that you've put off doing for the last 6 months because for some reason it's really important to do it right now. And then we're going to force ourselves finally to study, and then we're going to feel like shit about it, and we're going to have a meltdown, and then we're going to pick ourselves back up again, and then we're going to study a little bit more, and then we're going to procrastinate a little bit more, and then we're probably going to have another meltdown, and then the cycle continues onward and downward, not upward, onward and downward. So it's been a journey. This has kind of been my life for the last month and a half since the show closed at the end of January. What a fun place to be in my head. And by fun, I mean exhausting. But I am pleased to say that with studying, I think that I can do this. It has taken work to learn. It is uncomfortable. It's sitting down and being patient with yourself. And I, have a wonderful partner who understands that and encourages me to be patient with myself and tells me, you're not dumb, and it's not that you don't know how to do this. It's that you're learning how to do this. So it's been really helpful to reframe things in my brain saying, okay, it's not that you can't do this. It's just that it's going to take a little bit of time for you to work this problem out. Great therapist, great partner, and, friends who have been cheering me on from the sidelines. This isn't even the last exam I'm going to need to take. I'm going to need to take a ton more, but I do feel like this process has set me up for future ones pretty well. So by the time that this episode comes out and you're listening to this, I will be done. Fingers crossed. Okay, so today's episode. Today I talk to Jess, and I've had a number of people on the podcast to talk about the topic of non-monogamy. And that's what today's episode is about. I feel like every time that I talk to someone about it, I see things from like a new angle in a new way. It's been really fascinating to just like with guests hone in on one area. So today, Jess and I kind of start out talking about terminology, why she doesn't use the word ethical in front of non-monogamy. We talk about how to define non-monogamy because, and I was talking to my partner about this as I was editing this episode a couple days ago. It's a choose your own adventure thing. It's not like black and white monogamy or non-monogamy. And I've talked about this with guests in the past. Like, I have very intense female friendships in my life. Very intense. Like, one might even call them like homoromantic. One of my best friends says to me, like, yeah, like I'm a little bit in love with you. And I'm like, yeah, me too. Like, that's the type of friendships that I have. They're some of my female friendships are very strong and very intense in that way. And, you know, I think there's these ideas and these misconceptions, which Jess and I talk about non-monogamy, but it's all about communication, and couples of all kinds can learn from what's here in this episode. You know, Jess says people don't even necessarily have the same definition of monogamy. What one person thinks is cheating, the other person might think is totally fine. So it's important to communicate about that and get a sense of how your definitions are different and make sure that you're on the same page. And, you know, thinking about it, I was like, you know, I'm like monogamish because I don't really want to go off and have sexual experiences without my partner, and I don't want my partner to go off and have sexual experiences without me, but I wouldn't mind like doing something different, like together, having a new experience together. You know, I've always found like sex clubs really interesting. Never been, but am intrigued at the prospect, so I'd be open to that. And technically that is not 100% by the book monogamy. So it's interesting to kind of think about the definitions of what non-monogamy is versus monogamy and where you kind of fall, because the umbrella of non-monogamy is actually bigger than we think it is. So yeah, we talk about a lot of those definitions. We talk about communication. Like I said, people can learn a lot from the communication that people in non-monogamous relationships have. There's a difference between relationship agreements and rules and boundaries. So we chat about that. We talk about jealousy. We talk about steps to take if you are maybe interested in exploring non-monogamy. So yeah, let's get to it, shall we? All right, we're going to cut to a quick commercial break. And then please enjoy my conversation with Jess. Ooh, that sound wave looks like a dick.
Once upon a time, there was a princess. She was the most beautiful girl in the world, and the smartest, and the bravest. And she ruled the kindest kingdom under heaven. She was Princess Emerald, and her kingdom was Virtue Vista Valley. And children all over the world tuned in daily to learn from her and Sam and all their faithful friends. And everyone loved her. And then someone came and took the princess away. And he made her into something else. Something different than a princess. He turned her into a thing. A thing that has haunted my dreams for the last 14 years. Because she wasn't just a princess to me. She was my sister. My name is Alex Carmichael, and this is Wrought of Amber, a show about the horror of loss. Wrought of Amber, A Weeping Cedar's Story, stars Renee Vito as Alex Carmichael, with Ashton Laurel as Grace, and Michaela Walsh as Emily Carmichael. The full season drops for patrons at patreon.com/weepingcedars at the end of November 2023, and weekly to the public during December. Be sure to follow Weeping Cedars on Patreon for the free accompanying short stories that release with each episode.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I am very excited to introduce my guest today. Today, I have Jess on the show. Jess, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Rachel. Thanks so much for having me.
I'm excited to jump into this topic. And we were chatting a little bit beforehand. Today, we're going to talk about non-monogamy. And there are some word things that we were kind of talking about ahead of time. But before we get to that, let's just kind of have you tell me and the listeners a little bit about you, the work that you do, how you came to be involved in the work, just kind of the story of you.
Yeah, sure. The story of me, that sounds so like pretty and like so yeah, who am I? Yeah. So it's always a fun question when people ask you this and you're like, oh, it's like at the beginning of an interview where you're like, oh shoot, tell me about yourself. So yeah, I'm a therapist by background. I got my master's in social work back in, 2017 now, I guess, the same year I got married. And,
Congrats on both counts.
Oh, thanks. And thanks. Yeah. So I, got married, got my degree, moved to Delaware where I am now. I'm originally from the Poconos in northeastern PA.
Oh, you're near me. I'm in Philly.
Oh, cool. Yeah. And so, yeah, I was in the Poconos and then I was down around Philly for like 10 years.
Okay.
I went to Villanova and then Bryn Mawr. And I lived in Philly for a little bit in West Philly, and then got married, got the job in Delaware, moved here. And there's no sales tax here, which is cool.
Yes.
And yeah, I was doing my social worky thing and a lot of medical social work, ICU, hospice, that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I worked for a private practice and then ended up opening my own private practice last year. And kind of aroundish the time when I started thinking about opening like my own private practice, probably like, I don't know, 2-3 years ago, we were like in the midst of the pandemic. And so it was kind of like, what do I do? Like, do I do this? Do I wait? And at the same time, my kind of like personal life got like, I don't know, beautifully upended, I suppose, in that I like finally somehow came to realization that I was bisexual and had never really explored that and was seeing all this stuff about non-monogamy. I feel like I was like in my like glued to my phone permanently because pandemic and just like seeing all this stuff on non-monogamy. I'm like, what is up with this? Like I've heard of this, like as a therapist and stuff, like I had heard of it, but this is so interesting. And I'm thinking like, oh, my sociological background, right? No, it was not an interest thing. It was like oh shoot, I see myself in these people kind of thing. And yeah, so I kind of those two things converge, like seeing all of this stuff and seeing myself in it, and then also my sexuality stuff, and ended up kind of like coming out to my husband / sharing some of this stuff with him. And we opened our marriage. That was in May of 21. So yeah, that's kind of like personally what happened. And then so, I'm sure we'll talk about, but along that way and then opening my own practice, I really realized like how little resources there are for folks who are exploring non-monogamy. There definitely are a ton of great ones out there, and there's not like anywhere near the same amount as there is for monogamy. And so
Yes.
that's when I decided to open my second business and also do coaching in this realm. So that's kind of like how I got to here with you.
That is so cool. And I love the story of you, coming out to your husband, which is so important, so important to remember that just because somebody has married somebody who is het does not make them any less bisexual.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's exactly what I wrote when I came out on Facebook. So when I came out on Facebook and Instagram, it was like, I've come to this realization. So it was not this Pride, 2 prides ago, I guess, month. And I said exactly that. Like, I've come to the realization that I'm bisexual, and just because I'm married to a man, like, doesn't make me any less queer and all this stuff. And at the time, I also happened to have a girlfriend, but I did not throw that into the post. So I was like, maybe like, let's not lay it on too thick. But yeah.
Reel them in slowly.
Yeah, right? Like, here's just a little carrot. Yeah.
No, that's fascinating. And I mean, so non-monogamy. We're talking about words earlier. And I kind of want to dig into this first because I have been, words are hard. I've kind of been using the term ethical non-monogamy, which is a term that is used a lot. We were kind of talking about how polyamory was the term that was used first. And then there's that one term that they were using.
There's been so many. And then
what's that term that we were calling Mormons for a very long time?
Oh, polygamous.
Yes. There was that one,
Yeah. And there's all these words, and they do mean things. But we kind of just like, it's like I call it like pop psychology. Like, we take these words that we like only know a little tiny bit about, and we like throw them out there and like, oh, this is all the same thing. And I'm like, no, actually, no.
I was literally just talking to my therapist about pop psychology today.
Oh my gosh. Well, yeah, with everything, there's stuff going on. Yeah. Yes. It's a big thing all the time, right? We throw around other kinds of words like trauma and narcissistic and all that stuff. And so we do the same thing with non-monogamy for sure.
Okay. And so we started with, all of them, but we've ended up, I mentioned ethical non-monogamy and you were just like, hey, heads up, I don't use that term. Do you want to talk a little bit about the reasoning behind that? And share. I myself was really fascinated to learn about it.
Yeah, so sure. Yeah. So it's important to me to be transparent. Like you just said, you didn't know this. I did not know this myself. Until not that long ago, I had already started coaching and was using the words ethical non-monogamous relationship coach. And one of my other, I guess I can call her a colleague, though I feel like I'm fangirling, but another therapist / coach who is huge in the non-monogamous space, Rachel Wright, she posted on her, all her platforms, kind of resharing a story from, I believe it was Decolonizing Love. They're another non-monog kind of group out there. And they were talking about how, when we think about non-monogamy, I think a lot of people, and people ask me sometimes too, like, where is this coming from? Or why is this happening now? Or why is it becoming more popular? And it's a very similar construct to the whole queerness thing and trans rights. Like, trans people are not new. Queer people are not new. They have existed for eons from the beginning of time. And so has non-monogamy. And, not until certain constructs and societal forces came into play was monogamy then kind of seen as the right or correct way to do things. So where does this all come from? So many Native, Indigenous cultures, many still today cultures in other countries are and have been non-monogamous for the most part for a very long time. And so when we're using the word ethical in front of non-monogamy, it's kind of insinuating well, we want to call our thing like a special thing, right? Like this is a new special thing, ethical
Mm-hmm.
non-monogamy. But that kind of insinuates that like the eons of history before us were like not ethical in some way,
Right.
because we weren't using these fancy words, right? People were just living their lives quite literally. And there's huge numbers of populations on the entire continent of Africa, in other in the Middle East, in various religions and cultures that have been doing this forever. And so I don't want to insinuate anything about like, oh, well, the way I do it is ethical,
Right.
right? But this foundation and where this has come from and been forever, um, is not in some way ethical. So that's why I don't use that word anymore, but it is still very commonly used, especially because one of the acronyms people use a lot in the community is ENM.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Right.
people aren't just saying NM. So,
Right.
you know,
Yeah, I went through and like changed my notes just so I was like, oh yeah, like, just now that I know, I'll
yeah,
update it. And I was like, ooh, like that looks different.
it
NM
does.
looks
Yeah.
different from E&M.
Yeah.
Totally. Well, kind of going off of that, and I mean, you just did a beautiful kind of history of reminding us that this is not new.
Mhm.
Kind of dive into, I've talked to different people about non-monogamy, but I always like hearing people's fresh, like undiluted perspective. What is non-monogamy?
Yeah, that's the question, right? What are you doing? Yeah, so non-monogamy is the umbrella term for anyone in a relationship structure where they are not solely with one person, whether that's sexual relationships, romantic relationships, just deep emotional connections. It can really like run the gamut. But non monogamy, the word itself is like the umbrella term um, for people who have basically multiple connections. And underneath of that, like there's a bajillion subcategories, but um, underneath that, we do have and still use some of the words that you were describing earlier, and some of them we don't anymore. So, like on the theoretically more like sexual experience side, we have like swinging and open relationships. Sometimes people use open relationship as like an umbrella term, but most of the time they mean like an arrangement in which there's availability to have more than one sexual partner,
Right.
but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a couple doing this together, which is typically what we think of as swinging.
Right.
And then on kind of not the other side, we're all under the same thing. But then in terms of like more deep emotional connection, like relationship-y kind of stuff is like polyamory under there. And you mentioned polygamy. We don't there are folks and countries that still do practice polygamy. Really, the kind of main difference is polygamy refers to the marriage
Right.
of a person to more than one person, which is not legal in the US. It is allowable in some countries, and it's not necessarily that concept is an issue, because there are polyamorous people who are legally married to one person or not and have commitment ceremonies that look just like weddings with multiple people. So it's not that like the concept of marrying more than one person is an issue and that's why we don't promote polygamy. It's because typically the most common form of polygamy is where there's one husband with multiple wives and
Yeah.
the wives don't get any say in anything, can't have multiple partners themselves. So it's really more of like a super like misogynistic patriarchal
Totally.
thing. So it's not the marrying part that's really the issue. It's just like the history of this and kind of how it has been.
Yeah, and I think that's important to note too that I think that a lot of people non-monogamy like leaves a bad taste in their mouth, and
Mhm.
I wonder, I mean, first I wonder how much they actually know about it, because my
Yeah.
guess is not a lot. But, part of me wonders if that comes from this idea that, oh, well, it's just the man trying to fuck like
Oh,
multiple
for
people.
sure, right? Like people just think of the show Sister Wives on TLC.
Right.
And as far as I know, only one of those relationships is still intact of the four. And it is the person he was legally married to in the end. And like, I'm not here to shame the Browns either, but like, that's not what everyone's non-monogamous relationship looks like by any stretch of the imagination. So yeah, I think you're right that people just like don't know what they don't know and they hear a word. Even some people like in the community will like write, like new to the community who are trying to learn will write polygamy. And then like in all these Facebook groups I'm in and stuff, people will say, do you mean polygamy? I think you mean polyamory. And I'll say, oh my gosh, yes.
Amor. Polyamory, amor. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's, I mean, it's interesting too, thinking about sister wives and thinking about how people have all of these misconceptions about non-monogamy. And you have people on dating apps, I've seen it, where I'm just talking to my partner about this, where like you see people on dating apps who have like, oh, like ethically non-monogamous. And sometimes it just feels like it's guys out there who are looking for an excuse. And so I think that gives it a really bad name because, quite frankly, the non-monogamous people that I know and that I have interviewed are some of the best communicators. They have to be. Yeah. We're going to talk about that. Yeah. But what are some other like misconceptions about non-monogamy that you hear or that you want to set the record straight?
Yeah, for sure. Let's do that. Yeah, so I think what you're talking about is like this really fun person. Now, I don't want to stereotype, but I will say in my experience as a professional, on the whole, this has mostly been cisgender men that I see do this, where they'll say, oh, I'm polyamorous, but I haven't told my wife yet. Okay, no, that's not non-monogamy. That's just cheating. So yeah, I think there's like this what is it called? Not misunderstanding. Oh my gosh, you just said it.
Misconception?
Misconception. I could not, words are hard. So yeah, there's this misconception that like non-monogamy, people who are non-monogamous, it's just all about sex. And so like my first thing is, first of all, who cares? Like, why do we have to shame people for wanting to have sex with multiple people consensually and openly? Like, why is that an issue, first of all, right? And second of all, not everyone who's non-monogamous is, pursuing non-monogamy for that reason, sometimes at all. And sometimes that's not their main reason. And also, if it is, who the heck cares? So I think people just think like, I don't know, like me and my partners are like having an orgy every weekend or something. And I'm like, nah, that ain't it. Like at this point, I have two cisgender male partners, which was like not the plan, but this is what happened. They're not together. They're both with me, but they're not with each other. It's called a V relationship where I'm the hinge, like I'm the bottom of the V and they're, this is not a triad. They're not together. They're friends, but like, no, we don't just like walk around naked all the time. Also, who cares if we did? Like, why is this?
Right. Right. So why are people trying to control other people's bodies, which is just the biggest question in the world right now, right?
Like, I am not like walking down the street in front of 4 and 5-year-old children naked. Like, who cares if I'm doing that? Whatever. So like, that is not what my life looks like. And if it was, good for people who do that. If you have the stamina and desire to have orgies every weekend, more power to you, honestly. But yeah, so that's like a big one. And then the other one of the other big ones, this one, as someone who of the subsex of non-monogamy identifies as polyamorous, this one really bothers me. People will say or assume like, oh, well, you're non-monogamous because you don't want to or can't commit. And I'm like, okay, so I love both of these men dearly. I love them very much. And I am like exhausted of committing over here. Like, I am not like, there's no way to fathom in my mind how what I'm doing with my life is non-committal, right? Like I'm literally bouncing two entire relationships, one of whom is my legal husband. Like, what about that is not commitment, right? And, you know, again, not everyone who's non-monogamous is polyamorous. Not everyone is looking for, you know, what we typically think of as like a committed relationship. But I don't think that matters either. Like, if people just want to live their lives, like, why does it necessarily mean that I'm any less committed than when I was monogamously married?
Right.
So that's a big one. That really, I think that one gets under my skin more than some others, because for me, that's like the complete opposite of my personal experience and what I'm trying to do. And so it's like, why, like, what make, I really like would like to know, like, what makes you think that? Like, why, what about this says non-committal to you? So that's another one. I mean, there's so many. I really think that a lot of the other misconceptions are very like kind of how you were saying, you know, with like sister wives and things like that, where like people just hear the word non-monogamous or polyamorous or whatever, and they just get this picture in their head of like what that must look like. And they're like, well, that's what they're talking about. And they don't necessarily ask questions or look anything up with reputable sources. And so in their mind, like, that's just what this is. And, you know, it's right, wrong, or otherwise to them. And there's no like deviating from that. So I think that's another big piece, is people kind of like get in their heads what they think this looks like and is about, and why people do this. And they just kind of like hold tight and fast to that
without
definition.
any interest in like expanding their horizons or asking questions or learning. Definitely. And I think, I mean, most misconceptions about non-monogamy could be solved by asking those questions and having a desire to learn.
For sure.
So we kind of talked about communication. We touched on the fact that communication is so important, and that, you know, I mentioned that the non-monogamous couples that I know are better communicators than a lot of the people in monogamous relationships. Can we talk about that a little bit? The communication that is required, like when you are setting up, because I know that some couples do a contract, they do an agreement. They're like, you know, write it down, put it on paper. But when people are having the discussion, setting these rules, which is a vital part of the process, how do you communicate your needs, make sure you're hearing your partner's needs and being clear?
Yeah. So, you know, there's like a tiny bit of communication involved here. It's, you know, I tell people all the time, like, you talk about your feelings, and then you talk about your feelings, and then you listen to your partner talk about their feelings, and then you consider and or ask or have a conversation with your other partners about their feelings, and then you get some more feelings, right? Like, this is just what we do. Like, it's just and it sounds exhausting, and I'm not going to say that it's never exhausting, because like it is a lot. And I think that it's like the level of communication like required here to do this well and in a healthy way, I think is super beneficial to any couple,
Completely agree.
non-monogamous or not. So yeah, I mean, in terms of like the beginning, right? And figuring out like, okay, cool. So we both have agreed that we're okay with trying non-monogamy. Now what the heck do we do, right? And yeah, so big part of that beginning part is setting what we call relationship agreements. So the way I view these three things, so people use these words kind of interchangeably, but it's important to like be clear on what they are. So people use the words rules, boundaries, and relationship agreements as like the same thing.
Sure.
But they're not exactly. So the thing is, we have what are called relationship agreements in monogamy as well. We just don't voice them because we just kind of assume that we are on the same page, right?
And it's
like,
beneficial to voice them. I literally just finished Eric Kardosh's book, The Relationship Agreements.
Yeah, it's like if we would just talk about like what are your expectations? What are you hoping for? What are you wishing for? What are your like please considers here? Like, what would you like to see happen, or what would you not like to see happen, right? If we had those conversations in monogamous relationships, I think that would be huge, right? But so, getting back to in the beginning, we're trying to set this up, right? So the way I think of it and teach it is boundaries are your own personal fence. It's literally like a fence is a boundary, right? You're literally putting up your own fence that you're going to stay inside. And these are I statements, right? So if I'm trying to think, a boundary that one might have is I am not available to date individuals who XYZ, right? Maybe someone does not feel it's available to them to date someone who has children. Or maybe someone feels like it's not available to them to date someone who doesn't have children because they have children and they want this person to understand, right? So boundaries are what you decide for yourself. Boundaries are not telling other people what to do.
I feel like people are finally starting to get that in pop psychology. Yeah. I'm finally starting to like see that on Instagram. I'm like, all right, we're getting somewhere.
Finally. Yeah. Cause it's like, you could say to a person in any context, right? You can't talk to me that way. That's a rule. That's you making a decision for what someone else can and can't do. And it doesn't work that way, right? Because guess what? They're going to probably still talk to you that way. A boundary is saying, if you speak to me that way, I will remove myself from the room, right? This is what I am going to tolerate. And here's the line that I'm drawing. And then past that is what I'm not going to tolerate. Mm-hmm. So boundaries are like your own personal stuff. And then the way like rules and relationship agreements, so in my relationship, we don't use the word rules because rules are above us and relationship agreements are between us, right? Mm-hmm. So a rule is like this thing that like kind of feels like it hangs over your head and there's like a consequence, right? Like you will not do this or else this thing is going to happen or I'm going to do this.
There's a threat. There's a connotation, a threatening connotation.
Right. Versus relationship agreements, right? So try to think of an example. So one thing I think that's super important to communicate when you're figuring out relationship agreements in the beginning is I tell my clients this all the time, be more specific than you think you need to be. Because what's the worst thing that's going to happen? You're going to say something and they're going to be like, well, duh. Okay, that's great. But what you don't want to happen is to set a relationship agreement that's something along the lines of when we are out on a date, out with a play partner, whatever, we will be respectful of our original relationship. That is so vague, right? What does that mean? And this is kind of like ties into like what I was saying before with like monogamy, right? We just assume that we all have the same, like, oh, well, we're engaged or we live together or we're married or whatever, and we're monogamous. We just assume that the other person has the exact same relationship
definition of monogamous. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's not true, right? There are some people who see flirting at a bar to get a drink as cheating. And there are some people who don't. Right? So clearly not everyone who's monogamous is on the same page. So not everyone who's non-monogamous is on the same page. So saying things like, we will respect our relationship or we will check in with each other.
What does that mean?
It's just so vague. Like, what does that mean? So I've done that with my husband in the beginning. When we would go on dates, we would say like, we'll always check in with each other on dates. And we learned real quick that we did not have the same definition of that relationship agreement. So I ended up, we went back and I said, okay, here's what's important to me. You told me where you were going. If there's a change in location, I would like that to be communicated. So if you say we're going to such and such restaurant, whatever, not because I'm keeping tabs on you, just because quite literally, if you end up in a ditch, I'd like to know where to look. Right.
Like, yeah.
Or like, you don't know, like dating is sometimes a scary thing. Monogamous, non-monogamous doesn't matter, right? I don't know this person that you're going out with, and I don't need to. But if you're saying we're going to this restaurant and then you decide we're going to go like a late night glow bowling, or I'm going to go back to their place, or we're going to go get drinks this other place, just send me a quick text when you get in the car and say, hey, dinner was great. We're going to blah, be home later. That's it. I'm not trying to like, I'm not checking your location or anything. But being very specific about these things is what's most important. Otherwise, it's as if you don't have them at all. And so we're going to just like get back into that cycle. So yeah, I think that's like the most important part, is to be specific. And people ask a lot, like, I'll see this all the time too in like Facebook groups where they'll say something like, well, what boundaries or whatever they call it do you have in your relationship? And I think that that's fine in a sense, but that's not how we make agreements, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think the most helpful thing, and this is something I like super go into in my program because it's so important, is to like think of categorically what kind of areas your agreements need to be in versus like what the specific thing is that you're trying to ask other people. So like everyone should have relationship agreements around like safer sex, how much time is spent, whether that's on dates, play dates, or like on your phone talking to a person, right? Whether we're going to be out or not, we're going to share this with other people.
Mm-hmm.
Things like veto power, right? Do I have the right to tell my husband, no, you can't go out with that woman anymore? Things like this. So to think more like, start categorically. And I think that's a valid thing when you're first learning, to ask people like, hey, like what big picture categories do we need to think about here? Here are a bunch of them, right? Because what works as a relationship agreement for one person or group of people doesn't necessarily work for other people.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean, nobody's a monolith, right? Like,
Right.
and so we're all different. We're all going to have different needs. There are people who view your partner watching porn as cheating. And so it's important. And like you said, like monogamous couples can benefit from this.
Absolutely.
Because it's like not everybody has the same definition of even monogamy. So it's a good idea to get it straight. Well, so talking is the first part, sharing feelings.
Yeah.
It's just the big part of it is, so if somebody was curious about this and wanted to start opening up the conversation and just talking it to death is the best way to start.
Yeah. And I think if it's like a scenario like where I shared at the beginning, where like I'm bringing this up to my husband, we had not really ever talked about this. It's hard. Like, I'm not going to pretend that it's not, right? You're going to be scared. It's scary to bring something up like this to someone when you have no idea what they're going to say. And people ask me that a lot too. Like, how can I like try to gauge their reaction before I tell them? You really can't.
Yeah.
I mean, I tell people, you could theoretically, right? Like, find an article or I don't know, like a piece of media where there's like a non-monogamy featured or whatever, and say like, hey, I saw this, ... right? Like, but that's not the same thing as, do you want to do this, right?
Right.
So you really can't. I think it's scary. It's scary if you realize that this is something that like you feel like is part of who you are, or is just like something you really, really want to experience in your life. And now you're going to this person and you have no idea what they're going to say. So that's definitely scary. And then, theoretically, right, when we're talking about relationship agreements, we're talking about people who have already had that scary convo, right? And people have agreed like, okay, but now what, right? And so it's the communication piece. So you do that whole relationship agreement thing, right? And this is not something set in stone. I personally I don't call it a contract, but we do write down our relationship agreements, not for any other reason than to later return to them.
Sure.
Like when I was talking about the like checking in on dates or whatever, right? To go back and say, well, this is what we agreed to, but I don't know if I feel like that's working, right? So I think setting those relationship agreements and revisiting them, and not, this is so hard not to do, for especially in certain situations, not acting on anything until you've had that first conversation about relationship agreements.
Yes.
Because what easily happens, I get it. I have been there. You get all excited because you've just told this person and they're like, okay. Or maybe this is something you have talked about with your partner before and they're like, sure, yeah, we talked about that, right? Or, some people do explore non-monogamy solo in that they have multiple partners, but people get so excited and then they kind of jump in, and then all of a sudden they're like treading water and they're like, oh my God, we skipped some steps here. And now it's much more likely that way. It's okay. This is human. And it's much more likely that way that someone's feelings are going to get hurt. Someone's going to get the wrong impression of what this could be, right? Then we're going to get into this spiral of like, well, if this is what non-monogamy is, I'm not doing this, right? Whereas we could have just avoided a lot of that by having that conversation up front.
That's true. More misconceptions could come from people who tried it and didn't execute those relationship agreements early. You have to do the talking before you can do the dating or the fucking.
Absolutely.
Well, what about the big elephant in the room, the J word, jealousy?
I was like, what elephant? Oh, that elephant.
That one.
Yeah. So I think, that's another piece of that comes into misconception sometimes, is like I think people think that if you're non-monogamous, you must not get jealous or something. That's not true. Speaking from experience. So like, that's one of the main things, right? I always say, and I need to just do this already because I've said this so many times. I always tell people, like, I'm going to make a bingo card. When people are joking about like, my 2020 bingo card didn't have that. I always tell people I'm going to make a bingo card that's like responses I get when I tell people I'm non-monogamous, right? And like, one of the probably the number one is, I could never do that. Don't you get jealous? Or how do you not get jealous? Or something about jealousy. And so you do get jealous because that's a human emotion. And I think we have, so much of this whole process of non-monogamy and what I do with folks and what I've done in my own life is deconstructing what we think we know to be true, right? So this is just another thing on that list of like, well, let's deconstruct relationship norms. Let's deconstruct like why we have relationships the way we do and what's the quote unquote right way. And then let's deconstruct like, what's this jealousy thing about? Why do we paint this picture where jealousy is a negative emotion, right? People don't think of jealousy as anything positive usually.
Right.
And I personally and professionally don't believe any emotion is inherently negative or positive, because I think that insinuates that like you have some control, and newsflash, we don't have control over our thoughts or emotions. The only thing we can control is our reactions to those things.
100%.
And so jealousy is just a normal human emotion. It comes up. It's a physiological response in your body. It's okay. And you can tell yourself it's not okay all you want, but it's going to happen anyway. So I think the most useful thing is to figure out like what the heck to do with that, right? If this thing's going to happen anyway, we might as well figure out how to react or respond to it in like a useful way. So What does that mean? So really, like, I try to think of jealousy as when you feel those feelings that to you signify jealousy, whatever that feels like to you in your body, in your brain, just pause for a second and like try to like pick up the rock, if you will. Like, I'm thinking, I'm a 90s baby. I'm thinking like SpongeBob, like Patrick, like lifting the rock, right? Look underneath it and see what is under there, because you're not just feeling jealous for no reason, right? There's usually something either an insecurity that you have and or a need that you have that's not being fulfilled. And maybe that need has not even been expressed. So if, for example, like I meet someone that my husband is dating and let's say I meet them at a restaurant, and when I get there, they're holding hands. And I feel this like, oh, like not great response in my body. And I'm like jealous, like the green, right?
Mm-hmm.
What's that about? Well, maybe I'm feeling like we haven't been holding hands as much lately. Maybe I'm feeling like, we used to do that a lot in the beginning. Isn't that cute and nice? And I don't feel like we do that consciously or intentionally anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps I need to say that to him, right? Hey, it was so nice to meet so-and-so. It really like kind of hit me that you guys were holding hands when I got there, not because that's an issue, but because I realized that I would really appreciate if we were more intentionally intimate in that way. What do you think? Right? And I realize that the way it's coming out of my mouth right now sounds like I like do this perfectly every time. And I just like, my husband comes home and I'm like, oh, hi, dear. So I just wanted to like, no, that is not how it always comes out of my mouth. Sometimes it's like, could you put down your phone already? Right? Like sometimes it comes out as like he's texting someone or I'm texting or whatever. And one of us snips at the other and is like, could you like put your phone down? I thought we were supposed to be watching whatever, right?
Uh-huh.
So it's not like this just comes out perfectly. It's more about learning like how to tap into that emotion and like use it in a way that's useful either in your partnership or if it's like a personal insecurity, like body image
Right.
is a big thing, right? Or if I perceive that someone that my husband is dating or sleeping with or whatever is smarter or prettier or more successful or whatever, right? Just the way that I could do that with someone my husband is not dating or sleeping with, right? Any woman anywhere, right? That's telling me something about me, right? And my needs and like what I need to do to help myself feel better, because I don't want to feel like that all the time. That's not
No.
fun.
No.
And, so many of us women and, femme identifying individuals do feel like that a lot. So, I think it's, I try to see jealousy as more of an opportunity than like something to shove down and like push away and like, oh no, here it comes, like try to get rid of it.
Yeah, that's not going to go anywhere.
No, it is not. You're just going to shove it down and down and down and down. And then it's going to pop, and that's not going to be fun. Nobody likes that. You're going to end up in an argument, right? It's not going to be great.
You said something that kind of piqued my interest. I'm wondering if how different non-monogamous couples handle this. Mm-hmm. So it sounds like in your situation, you meet people that your husband is dating, and like from your core relationship, you meet people that your husband is dating and he meets people that you're dating. Mm-hmm. Do you recommend that? Are there couples who, are kind of do like a more of a don't ask, don't tell policy? Like what's the situation there?
Yeah. So there's options, as with anything usually. I believe everything in life is a spectrum. And so, we can go all the way from, let me tell you absolutely every single detail ever, which most people don't do and isn't always comfy, to let me not tell you any single thing ever or breathe a word of it, which most people also don't do and usually isn't comfy.
Everything in moderation.
Yeah. But, so us personally, our relationship agreement around meeting. So I would call my partner's partner my metamor. So someone my husband is dating or whatever, that's my metamor. So our relationship agreement around meeting metamors is we are open and available to meet anyone anytime if that's something that they want and they're cool with. We don't have what I would call a rule where like I have to meet them, right? Because to me personally, that feels more like a rule where it's like, right, I have to meet them what or else what? Like you can't date them if I don't meet them. So I So for us, yes, I've met a few people that my husband has dated in the past. I have not yet met the woman he's dating right now, which I'm like so excited to, but we have like texted and stuff. But I've not met every single person he's like ever gone out with at all or slept with at all. But some of them, the ones, that he sees more frequently or stick around or whatever. And he has met my current other partner. We've been together for just over a year now. So they have interacted many times. There's like a whole spectrum here. So like for us in polyamory, we prefer to practice what's called kitchen table polyamory, KTP, which is kind of what I'm describing, where like we could all hang out together. Theoretically, we could sit down at a table and all have dinner together. Like people are not just cordial, like there's also some sort of like mini relationship, friendship things going on. But you don't have to do that by any means. Some people who are polyamorous practice entirely parallel, meaning they never meet each other's partners. And that's fine. That's just, again, something that you have to be upfront about, right? So when you're going out with other people or interacting with other people, you have to be upfront. Hey, just so you know, one of our relationship agreements is that we practice parallel. This is not like a thing that is available for you to meet my partner. I'll let you know if that changes, if that were something you're interested in. And some people will say, no, thank you, right? Like, I don't want to. That can be a personal boundary. I do not want to be in a relationship with someone where I will never be able to meet their partner, right? That's a fine personal boundary to have.
Just means you go your separate directions. Yeah.
Right, exactly. What's not fine is when you're trying to make rules for other people and say, you have to introduce me to, right? Or they have to meet me, right? So, yeah, so we do practice pretty kitchen table-y, but not everyone does. And the same with like on the more specifically sexual exploration side of non-monogamy. Some like swingers, typically, not always, but typically only play together. And so they always meet. They're right there.
Right.
Some folks in what they might term an open relationship only play separately. There might be other agreements around like where, like in our house, not in our house in the spare room, not in our bed, like these kind of things. Some folks never meet their partners, play partners. Some of them do. Some of them are friends. It's really, I don't know if I could say, well,
to choose your own adventure, really, right?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. It reminds me of all those like little mystery novellas, right? I think like in general, would I personally advise someone or to do a don't ask, don't tell? Probably not. Mm-hmm. Do I think that can work for a small subset of people? Sure. And if that's you, you do you. And in my experience, for the most part, it just eats away at you.
Yeah.
So I say, if that's what you want to do and you really can both be okay and you're both being open and honest about the times when you're not okay, then that's great. I personally could not do that. But that doesn't mean that like what works for me has to work for other people. That's like the whole point of this choose your own adventure game.
Absolutely.
Right?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, Jess, do you have any last, pieces of advice or things? One of my questions was going to be, what can monogamous couples learn from people who are in non-monogamous relationships? But I really feel like all you have to do is kind of listen to this episode to understand that. Yeah. But any last thoughts? And then go ahead and let people know where they can find you.
Yeah. Last thoughts. Yeah. I mean, I think we did talk about that a lot. So I think, overall last thoughts are, if you are like listening to this and you've like gotten this far somehow, but you're like, nah, I'm not buying it. I don't like this idea. I don't think this is good, whatever. That's cool for you. That's absolutely fine for you. And other people get to make their own choices, right? Mm-hmm. So, and don't we want to live in a world where that's the case, right? Where people get to make their own choices. So, I just would encourage anyone who's like feeling judgment come up for them. That's totally normal and fine and valid. And again, look under that rock and do some research, talk to someone, reach out to me. I don't care. I think that's one piece. And then for those of y'all who are listening and are either curious or already embracing whatever form of non-monogamy it is, you do you, boo. Like, just you do you. There's going to be haters. There's always going to be haters, right? It's okay to live a life that other people don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And it's taken me, I'm not perfectly there by any stretch of the imagination. I have cried about this so many times, whether it's like people in my own family or, people on social media who post like, be gone, heathen, or whatever when I post stuff. Like, I know. Other people are entitled to their opinion, and that doesn't mean that I'm doing anything wrong. So right. I think like just keep in mind that like you are the only person who knows like what you are really doing and like what's important to you and what your life is about and whether you're being honest about things. So yeah, in terms of, if anyone wants to chat or find out information or whatever, so I have two kind of like specific coaching programs, group coaching programs. One is kind of what we were talking about with like, help, I want to bring this up to my partner and have no idea and I'm terrified. That's a mini program I do for 4 weeks. It's called the Conversation Compass and walks you through all that stuff. And then my bigger program is called Non-Monogamous Newbies. You do not have to be a newbie. I really like try to reach out and market to people who like, yeah, sure. If you're a newbie and you have not even like had the relationship agreement convo yet, please let's do this now. This is a great time to do it. And if you have already like kind of done this and you're one of those people that's like, oh, I think I missed some steps and you want to hit the reset button, this is a good way to do it because it's 12 weeks. We go all the way from like your why of non-monogamy through all that stuff, relationship agreements, jealousy, conflict, coming out, all that kind of stuff. And I also do some like customized stuff here and there. So you can find all that stuff on my website, which is www.bothandcoaching.com, BOTHAND coaching.com. And if you're looking for like some free resources, want to like get a better feel for like me, my community, how I teach, all that kind of stuff, I have a free Facebook group. It's private, so no one will see that you're in it. It's called Non-Monogamous Newbies, so you can look that up on Facebook. I'd love to bring you into the group. Everyone's very kind there. We have like 250-ish members now, so it's a great group of folks. And we'd love to have you. I go live on different topics that the group chooses, like all kinds of freebies out there floating in my group. So really I'm just, this is part of my job, right? But more than anything, it's like I wish that I had someone to like walk next to me and guide me when I did this. It would have been a whole hell of a lot easier than like winging it, basically. So yeah, that's how folks can find me.
Amazing. Jess, thank you so much for sharing your story, your expertise, everything you've learned, and also just like being so like honest about the fact you didn't come on here and be like, oh, well, like I have it all figured out and this is how it works. You came on and you were like, all right, like this is how it goes. And it is sometimes a mess, but it's
a beautiful mess, but
exactly.
Mess, for sure.
I was gonna say.
Yeah.
So thank you, Jess. I appreciate you coming on and sharing. And thank you, listeners, for tuning in. You've been listening to Wine, Dine, and 69. I am your host, Rachel Dalton, and let's keep talking.